The water was warmer than a man had any right to expect, and that was the first cruelty of it. Warm water lets a body last. It gives him time. Time to feel the salt find every torn place on him. And there were a lot of torn places. His scalp was open. His left ear hung ruined against the side of his head. A bullet had punched clean through the meat of his left calf, and his arms and his shoulders and his groin were peppered with steel splinters where the cannon shells had found his cockpit before he ever hit the sea. By his own account, given years later, he had counted the damage the way a mechanic counts a wreck, part by part, refusing to add it up. Above him, the sky over St. George's Channel had gone quiet. A few minutes earlier, it had been full of engines and tracer and the flat hammering of guns, 40 and more airplanes turning and diving between New Britain and New Ireland, the deep water of the Channel waiting underneath all of it. Now the fight had moved on the way air fights always did, sliding away across the sky in seconds, and it had left one man alone in a rubber raft the size of a bathtub, bleeding into the Pacific, watching for the airplanes to come back and finish him. They came back. He would say later that Japanese fighters strafed him in the water, that he rolled out of the little raft and hung beneath it and let them shoot the raft to pieces rather than shoot him. Whether that happened exactly as he told it, we cannot fully prove, and I will be honest with you about that pattern all the way through this story because it matters. What we can prove is that he was down and he was hurt, and for the next 20 months the United States of America would believe he was dead. Then the ocean itself seemed to lift and break, and a long gray shape rose out of it, and men in unfamiliar uniforms were looking down at him from the deck of a submarine. And Major Gregory Boyington of the United States Marine Corps, the highest scoring fighter pilot the Marine Corps had, understood in that moment that he had just become a prisoner of the Japanese Empire. Now hold that picture, because everything about it is a question. How does the best fighter leader the Corps has ever put in the air end up alone in the water off Rabaul with no one coming for him? Why, when the Marine Corps finally pins the Medal of Honor on this man, does the number engraved into the story turn out to be wrong, and possibly wrong on purpose? And why had his own Marine Corps already tried, more than once, to be rid of him for good before the war even started? This is the story of Pappy Boyington, not the one the television show sold you. The real one is better, and it is harder, and it cuts closer to the bone. Start with the name itself, because even the name is not quite what it seems. If you grew up watching the show, you know him as Pappy, the grizzled old man of the squadron, the wild rebel leading a pack of misfits. Almost none of that is true the way you were told it. His pilots did not usually call him Pappy at all. That nickname was largely a creation of the wartime press, a handle a public relations officer could sell to newspapers back home. In the Solomons, the men of his squadron more often called him Gramps, and they called him that because at 30 years old, he was a decade older than most of the kids flying his wing, not because he was some ancient desert prophet of the air. Keep that in mind as a small key to the whole story. Almost everything you think you know about this man passed through a machine that made him bigger and simpler than he was. My job in the next hour is to run the story backward through that machine and show you what was actually there. He was born on December 4th, 1912 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. His father was a dentist. His parents split when he was an infant, and here is the first strange thread. He was raised believing his name was Gregory Hallenbeck, believing his stepfather was his father, and he did not learn that his real name was Boyington until he was a grown man. That accident of identity would matter later, in a way you would never guess, because when he wanted to become a Marine aviation cadet, the service would not take married men within 2 years of earning their wings, and a man carrying one legal name while married under another had room to maneuver that an honest man did not. I will let you sit with what that tells you about him. He grew up in Idaho and then in Tacoma, Washington. He wrestled in high school. He went to the University of Washington and studied aeronautical engineering. He wrestled and swam there too, and he was good at it. Good enough that the physical fearlessness that later kept him alive in a cockpit was already visible on a wrestling mat. He took a commission for a while in the Army Reserve and the Coast Artillery, and he worked as a draftsman and engineer at Boeing. He married a young woman named Helene in 1934, and then, in February of 1936, he enlisted as a Marine Corps aviation cadet, and in March of 1937 at Pensacola, Florida, he earned the wings of a naval aviator. On paper, a clean start. A college man, an engineer, an athlete, a new set of gold wings. In the air, he was a natural, and everyone who flew with him would say so for the rest of his life. That was never in dispute. What was in dispute, from very nearly the beginning, was everything that happened on the ground. Because here is the part the legend needs and the biography confirms. Gregory Boyington drank. He drank hard. He fought. And he spent money he did not have. By the end of the 1930s, he was so deep in debt that Marine Corps headquarters required him to submit a letter every single month accounting for what he had paid against each of his loans. Think about that. This is a peacetime Marine Corps officer whose superiors have so little faith in him that they make him file monthly paperwork proving he is paying his bills. Bruce Gamble, whose biography, Black Sheep 1, is the most careful account of this man's life ever written, describes an officer whose personal conduct had made him a problem the Corps wanted solved. In plain terms, he was encouraged to leave. The Marine Corps, the institution that would one day put its highest honor around his neck, was in 1940 ready to show him the door. And this is the pattern I want you to watch for because it repeats. The system that produced Boyington could not stand Boyington. The qualities that made him lethal in a cockpit, the aggression, the refusal to be managed, the contempt for the man behind the desk, were exactly the qualities that made him a disaster in a garrison. The Corps wanted the pilot and did not want the man, and it never fully resolved that contradiction. It just kept running into it. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. And I will say this too. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and asking specifically for the Marine Air War and the Corsair squadrons. And some of you have fathers or grandfathers who flew or turned wrenches on those airplanes. I want to do it justice. Now, back to a broke Marine lieutenant in 1941 who has just found a way out of his debts and into a war that is not yet his country's war. The way out was China. In the summer of 1941, a retired Army airman named Claire Chenot was building a mercenary air force to fight for nationalist China against Japan, recruiting American service pilots through a front company to fly Curtiss fighters under the Chinese flag. The pay was extraordinary for the time. A flight leader could draw around $675 a month, real money in 1941, and on top of the salary, there was a bonus, commonly cited at $500 for every enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed. For a man drowning in loans, that bonus was not an abstraction. It was a lifeline with a number attached. And I want you to remember that the money was paid by the airplane, because it is going to distort the record in a way that follows Boyington for the rest of his life. He resigned his Marine commission in August of 1941 and signed on with the American Volunteer Group, the outfit history would remember as the Flying Tigers. The airplane he flew was the Curtiss Hawk 81, the export version of the early P-40, the short-nosed Tomahawk, not the later long-nosed Warhawk you may be picturing, and it wore the Chinese 12-pointed sun, not an American star. Sometime that autumn, the group copied a shark-mouth design from a photograph of British fighters in North Africa and painted it across the noses of their hawks. And that snarling mouth became one of the most famous markings in the history of flight. If you ever see a flying tiger seen with a long-nosed warhawk wearing American stars, you are looking at the wrong airplane and the wrong markings. And this audience knows it. Boyington flew and fought over Burma and China through the winter and spring of 1941 into 1942. And now we arrive at the first place where the legend and the record come apart. So watch closely, because the same crack runs through the whole life. Boyington claimed 6 victories with the Flying Tigers. He claimed that number to his dying day. It went into the newspapers, it went into the Marine Corps records, and it became the foundation of the famous total everyone remembers. But when the historian Frank Olenek went back and reconstructed the actual American Volunteer Group combat records, aircraft by aircraft, he could confirm only 2 air-to-air kills for Boyington, 2 Japanese fighters over Rangoon on February 6, 1942. Chenot's own citation from that spring credited him with something like 4.5 aircraft total, of which only 2 were destroyed in the air, and the rest burned on the ground during a raid on an airfield where the credit for the parked planes was split among all the pilots who took part. The mercenary pay records show him bonused for 3.5, so here is the arithmetic that built a legend. 2 aircraft shot down in the air. A share of some airplanes destroyed on the ground. Round it up, add a little, and you have 6. Daniel Ford, whose book Flying Tigers is the most rigorous account of that group ever assembled, put it plainly. Those 2 fighters over Rangoon were Boyington's only confirmed aerial victories with the Tigers, and once the figure of 6 made it into print, there was no taking it back. I think Ford is right, and I think it is the single most important thing to understand about this man before we go 1 mile further, because it is not an accusation of cowardice. Boyington was as brave as any man who ever strapped into a fighter. It is something subtler and sadder. He learned early that the number was the currency, that the number was what bought the medals and the headlines and the promotions, and he treated the number the way he treated money, as something to be inflated when the situation called for it. I should be fair to him about the flying itself, because he could genuinely do it. Over Rangoon in the winter of 1942, he flew hard against Japanese Army fighters, nimble little machines that could outturn the heavier American Hawks, and the tactic Chennault drilled into his pilots was to never dogfight them, to dive in fast from above, fire and keep going, using the Hawks' weight and speed rather than fighting on the enemy's terms. Boyington understood that kind of flying in his bones. The problem was never his courage or his skill. The problem was always the paperwork and the men who kept it. Many of the wildest stories from his China days, the drunken escapades, the affair with the wife of a group staff officer, come almost entirely from his own later telling, and I would ask you to treat them the way I treat the kill claims, as Boyington's version of Boyington, entertaining, self-serving, and impossible to fully verify. Daniel Ford, who chased these tales down, believed the reputation was considerably larger than the reality. The one thing that is beyond dispute is that he left China with almost everyone in authority glad to see him go. He did not last with the Flying Tigers. He clashed with Chennault constantly, chafed under the discipline, resented the missions he was assigned. And when the group was folded into the Army Air Forces in the middle of 1942, Boyington did not go with it. He quit and made his own way home, a long, grinding journey by ship halfway around the world, arriving back in the United States, having burned the bridge behind him. Research into Chennault's own files suggests Boyington's departure amounted to something close to a dishonorable discharge from the group. He had gone to China, a broke Marine, and come home an unemployed one, with a war on and no airplane to fly. So he crawled back to the Corps he had left. And the remarkable thing, the thing that tells you how desperate the Marine Corps had become for experienced fighter pilots by 1942, is that it took him. The same service that had wanted him gone 2 years earlier pinned a major's oak leaves on him and sent him to the Pacific, because in the middle of a war, a man who could actually fly and fight was worth more than a man who paid his bills on time. The needs of the war papered over the judgment of peacetime. For a little while. It was not a smooth return, even so. He did not walk straight into a fighter cockpit in glory. He spent months in the South Pacific in staff and executive jobs, flying a desk and then flying as an executive officer under other men, chafing, aging, watching younger pilots get the commands he wanted, a major in his early 30s who felt the war passing him by. When the chance finally came to build his own squadron in the late summer of 1943, he was, by the standards of fighter pilots, an old man reaching for one last shot at the thing he was born to do. That hunger, the sense of a clock running out, is all over what happened next. He was not a young gunslinger. He was a desperate veteran who knew this was probably the only command he would ever get. The airplane he flew was the one his name would be married to forever, the Vought F4U Corsair. Now, I need to be precise here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that separates a real history from a cartoon. The early Corsair, the F4U one, had a heavily framed sliding canopy that the men called the bird cage, and it sat the pilot low. By the second half of 1943, a new version was reaching the squadrons, the F4U-1A, with the seat raised and a blown, clearer canopy with far fewer frames, so the pilot could actually see behind him. Boyington's squadron in the Solomons flew a mix of these in the autumn of 1943, and by the deep raids on Rabaul at the very end of that year and the start of 1944, the raised cabin airplane was the one he took to war. The Corsair had a bent, inverted gull wing so a big enough propeller could clear the ground. It was built around the enormous Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp engine, and it was the first American single-engine fighter to break 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Japanese who faced it called it Whistling Death. But it did not start as a beloved airplane. The Corsair came into service with a vicious reputation. Its long nose blocked the pilot's view straight ahead on the landing approach. That early birdcage canopy made it hard to see out of at the worst possible moment, and it had a nasty habit of dropping a wing and bouncing on touchdown, which is exactly why the Navy at first judged it unfit to fly off carrier decks and handed it to the land-based Marine squadrons in the Solomons. The men who tamed it did so the hard way, and by the time Boyington took it into the deep raids, the Marines had turned an airplane the Navy did not trust into the most feared fighter in that theater. That is worth remembering, because it is the same story as the man. A difficult, dangerous instrument that the institution nearly rejected, made lethal by the people willing to wrestle with it. Get the variant right, get the canopy right, and you will never hear about it in your comments. Get it wrong, and you will hear about nothing else. And now, the squadron. Because the squadron is where the biggest myth of all was manufactured. In the late summer of 1943, Boyington was handed a collection of replacement pilots at a rear area in the Pacific and told to build them into a fighter squadron, Marine Fighting Squadron 214, in a matter of weeks. The television show would later tell you these were misfits, criminals, and screwballs, the dregs of the Marine Corps swept together under a rogue commander. That is fiction. It is good fiction, but it is fiction. The men of that squadron were, by the assessment of the people who actually knew them, a solid and professional group of aviators, no more troubled than any other squadron thrown together in a hurry in wartime. Frank Walton, the squadron's own intelligence officer, spent years after the war trying to correct exactly this slander, and his book, Once They Were Eagles, was written in part to give those men back their real reputations. I think that correction matters, and I want to be careful about it, because the easy version of this story makes Boyington a lone wolf leading a pack of outlaws, and the true version is more interesting. He was a gifted, difficult man, leading a good squadron inside a well-run Marine Air Wing, and the wing gave him the airplanes, the intelligence, the maintenance, and the wingmen that made the scoring possible. He did not do it alone, and pretending he did insults the men who died making it work. The name itself tells the story of the machine. The pilots first jokingly called themselves Boyington's Bastards. A public relations officer pointed out that no newspaper in America would print that word, and so, right around the middle of September 1943, it became the Black Sheep, and the squadron badge kept a little bar of illegitimacy across the corner as an inside joke about where the name had come from. Notice what just happened. The very first thing the war did with this squadron was sand off its rough edge so it could be sold to the public. The Black Sheep were a brand almost before they were a fighting unit. They fought inside a machine that is almost never given its due. By the autumn of 1943, the Air Command in the Solomons had become one of the best-run fighting organizations in the American arsenal. A joint force of Marine, Navy, Army, and New Zealand squadrons, grinding down Japanese air power over Rabaul week after week, feeding fresh squadrons in and pulling exhausted ones out on a schedule, coordinating fighter sweeps and bomber escorts across hundreds of miles of ocean. Boyington's squadron did not appear out of nowhere, and it did not fight alone. It was one blade in a very sharp instrument supplied and directed and covered by thousands of men whose names never made a headline. I keep coming back to this because the legend needs him to be a rebel operating outside the system, and the truth is the opposite. The system was superb, and it is what made his 84 days possible. Hold on to that. It is going to matter when we weigh the man at the end. But then they fought, and this part is not inflated as a whole. Over roughly 84 days of combat, across 2 tours from the middle of September 1943 to the 3rd of January 1944, the pilots of Marine Fighting Squadron 214 were credited with destroying or damaging around 200 enemy aircraft, with something on the order of 97 confirmed shot down in the air, and they produced 8 aces. That is a genuinely fearsome record for a single squadron in under 3 months, and Boyington led it from the front, flying more than his share and scoring more than anyone. And who were these men the television show would slander as jailbirds and washouts? Let me give you a few of them by name, because they have waited a long time for it. There was Christopher Magee, called Wildman, who scored around 9 victories, wore the Navy Cross, and after the war flew for Israel in its War of Independence, and later, astonishingly, turned to armed robbery and did time for it, a life stranger than any script. There was Robert McClurg, credited with 7. There was Paul Mullen, called Moon, with 6.5. And there was John Bolt, a black sheep, who scored 6 with Boyington in the Solomons, and then did something no other Marine ever did, going to Korea years later and shooting down 6 Soviet-built jets in the F-86 Sabre, becoming the only Marine jet ace and the only Marine to make ace in 2 different wars. These were not misfits. These were killers and professionals, and several of them were extraordinary men in their own right. Boyington led them. He did not invent them, and he did not carry them. Remember their names the next time you see the cartoon. The signature day came on October 17th, 1943, over the Japanese airfield at Kahili on Bougainville. Boyington led a formation of Corsairs down over the field and, in effect, dared the Japanese to come up and fight, circling the base at altitude, taunting them by radio, baiting the defenders into the air where his fighters were waiting. As the account in Gamble's history has it, of around 60 aircraft based there, some 20 were shot down that day, and not one black sheep was lost. It was audacious, it was brilliant, and it was exactly the kind of aggressive, contemptuous, rules-be-damned leadership that made him magnificent in the air and impossible on the ground. That day went straight into his Medal of Honor citation, and it earned its place there honestly. What made Boyington dangerous in the air was not just nerve, though he had plenty. It was a hunter's patience welded to a brawler's aggression. He was a superb deflection shooter, able to hit an airplane that was crossing his path rather than sitting still in front of him, which is the hardest shot in airfighting, and the one that separates the true killers from the merely brave. He led from the front, took the worst position himself, and used his experience to put younger pilots where they could score and survive. When he circled Kahili and taunted the Japanese into the air, he was not being reckless for the newsreels. He was using everything he knew about how the enemy thought, baiting them into a fight on his terms, high and fast and coordinated. That is command in the air at its finest, and no dispute about his final numbers can take it away from him. He was, when he was flying, one of the best there was. Everything tragic about him lived on the ground. But here is where I have to make you uncomfortable, because this channel does not flinch from the hard part. The Black Sheep record, fearsome as it is, was also inflated, and so was nearly every air combat record in that war on every side. Overclaiming was universal. In the heat of a turning fight, 3 pilots would each fire at the same burning airplane, and each would honestly believe he had killed it, and the claims board back on the ground had almost no way to sort it out. Bruce Gamble, going through the Japanese loss records against the American claims, concluded that of roughly 160 aircraft credited to Boyington's squadron, perhaps only a third were real. On one single day in late December 1943, the squadron claimed 26 Japanese airplanes shot down. The Japanese records for that day show only 3 of their pilots failed to return. I am not telling you this to tear down the Black Sheep. I am telling you because the men who really flew those missions deserve a history built on facts and not on newspaper arithmetic. And because if you do not understand how loose the numbers were for everyone, you will never understand how Boyington's personal total became the tangled thing it is. Through the autumn, his personal number climbed, and as it climbed, something happened that I want you to see clearly, because it is the hinge of the entire story. The press discovered him. A Marine ace closing in on the great American record, 26 victories, the mark set by Eddie Rickenbacker in the First World War, and matched by the Marine ace Joe Foss the year before, was a gift to war correspondents. You have to understand what that record meant to Americans then. Eddie Rickenbacker was not just a number. He was the great American ace of the First World War, a former race car driver turned national idol, a living link to the last war, and his mark of 26 had stood as the American benchmark for a quarter century. Joe Foss had just matched it over Guadalcanal and become a household name for it. To pass that number was to write yourself into the front rank of American legend, and every reporter in the Pacific knew it, and so did Boyington. The record was not a private milestone. It was a national event waiting to happen, and a broke kid who had spent his whole life feeling like he was not enough now had the entire country watching to see if he would reach the one number that would make him, at last, undeniable. And once the record was in reach, the scoring stopped being only about the war and started being about the number. Boyington was flying toward a headline. And the same Marine Corps that was feeding him to the newspapers was, at the very same moment, so exasperated with his conduct on the ground that in November of 1943, one of his superior officers, a lieutenant colonel named Joseph Smoke, had him placed under arrest for 10 days for going over his head to talk to the wing staff without permission. Sit with the contradiction, because it is the whole man in one frame. In the same season, the United States Marine Corps was building him into a national hero in the papers and locking him up for insubordination in the field. It could not decide whether he was its finest weapon or its worst headache, and the honest answer is that he was both at the same time, and the Corps never found a way to hold both truths at once. And if that sounds familiar, if you have ever watched the person who is actually best at the work get written up and sidelined by the people who manage upward and look good in meetings, you are not imagining the pattern. It is older than any of us. It just does not usually come with a medal at the end. I will not belabor the comparison, because you already understand it better than the men who filed the arrest paperwork did. So we come to the last flight, and now the cold open closes its circle. On the 3rd of January, 1944, Boyington took off from the airfield at Torokina on Bougainville, in tactical command of a large fighter sweep against the great Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, a mixed force of Marine Corsairs and Navy Hellcats, dozens of airplanes sent to hunt Japanese fighters over their own base. He was flying an F4U Corsair, the raised cabin airplane, Bureau number 17915. He needed, depending on which count you believe, 2 or 3 more kills to pass the record. He had brought along a wingman named George Ashman. Ashman was a reserve officer from Far Hills, New Jersey, a Hobart College man who had flown something like 67 missions without a single victory to show for it. And Boyington had grown fond of him and had deliberately taken him under his wing to help him finally score. The Japanese fighters that came up to meet them that morning belonged to two veteran naval air groups, the units the Japanese numbered 204 and 253, based around Rabaul, some of the last hardcore of naval fighter pilots the Empire had left in that theater. The sweep was tangled with them over the water in the middle of the morning. And here is a number worth setting against the claims. For all the airplanes claimed by both sides in the swirling fight that day, the actual Japanese fighter losses on the 3rd of January were only 2 zeros. 2. That is the gap between what men believe they see in a three-dimensional knife fight at 300 miles an hour and what the cold records show afterward. And it is the gap this whole story lives inside. Boyington claimed 3 victories in that last combat. Here's the crucial fact, the one the newsreels never mentioned and the television show could not use. Only one of those 3 kills, the one that tied the American record, was witnessed by other American pilots. The other 2 were unwitnessed. There was no one else there to see them, and they were entered into the record only later, on the combat report he signed after the war, after 20 months in which everyone assumed he was dead. The historian Michael Claringbold, working from Japanese records, confirms that 2 of the 3 claims from that final fight had no witness. And I have to tell you what I think, because I have spent a long time with this record. I think it is entirely possible those airplanes went down exactly as he said, and I think it is also possible that a man obsessed with a number, given the chance after the war to write his own final tally, with no one able to contradict him, wrote the number he wanted. Both of those can be true. We will never know which, and any history that pretends to know is lying to you. What is not in dispute is what happened to Boyington and Ashman. In the swirling fight, both Corsairs were hit. Ashman's airplane caught fire and went into the sea, and George Ashman was killed, his body never found, later awarded a posthumous decoration for staying on his leader's wing to the end. And Boyington's Corsair was shredded around him, the cannon shells finding his cockpit and his body, and he went down into St. George's Channel, wounded in the scalp and the ear and the leg and a dozen other places, into the warm water where we began. For decades afterward, a Japanese pilot named Masajiro Kawato claimed that he was the man who shot Boyington down, and he made a small career of it, appearing at air shows, selling the story. I want to be clear with you, because your instinct for a good, clean ending will want this to be true. It is not. The historian Henry Sakida, whose book Pacific Air Combat is built entirely on Japanese unit records, went through the logs of the units in that fight and demonstrated that Kawato's claim, and the phrase Sakida used, is groundless and without a basis, in fact. Kawato was flying overhead cover that day, not in the fight where Boyington fell, and his own earliest memoir did not even mention Boyington. The truth is less satisfying and more honest. No single Japanese pilot can be credibly named as the man who brought down Pappy Boyington. The record simply does not support a clean villain, and I would rather give you the messy truth than the tidy lie. Then he was gone, and this is where the story does something almost no other story does. Because the Marine Corps believed Gregory Boyington was dead, and a dead ace on the edge of the national record is a very different thing from a living headache who keeps getting himself arrested. Presumed killed in action, unable to embarrass anyone, he was suddenly perfect. In March of 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt approved the Medal of Honor for him, and because he was thought to be dead, it was treated as a posthumous award, the way the nation honors a man it can no longer be disappointed by. Here is a truth about him that some of his own contemporaries put on the record. Up to the moment he vanished, Boyington had not received a single major decoration. His conduct had kept the recommendations from being written. At one point, the Army wanted to give him a medal for protecting its bombers, and Marine leadership waved it off, saying the Corps would decorate its own Marines, and then the Corps had not gotten around to actually doing it. Let that settle. The finest fighter leader the Marine Corps had put in the sky in that war reached the moment of his disappearance with his chest bare of the honors his flying had earned, because the institution could not separate the pilot it admired from the man it could not manage. And the medal came, when it finally came, in the one window when the man could no longer cause any trouble. In the window when he was, as far as anyone knew, safely dead. I find that one of the most quietly damning facts in the whole history of American air power, and I do not say that lightly. Except he was not dead. He was in a cell. The submarine that pulled him from the channel took him to Rabaul, where he was interrogated and beaten. In February of 1944, he was flown north with a handful of other prisoners toward the great Japanese base at Truk. And in one of the cruelest ironies of his whole cruel war, his airplane landed there just as an enormous American carrier raid fell on the base, and the bomber that had carried him was destroyed almost the moment he climbed out of it, so that he very nearly died under American bombs as a prisoner of the enemy. From there, he was moved to Japan itself, first to a brutal naval interrogation camp called Ofuna, where the ration was a starvation ration, and later to a camp called Omori on an island in Tokyo Bay. Among the prisoners he lived alongside was the Olympic runner Louis Zamperini, whose own survival became a famous book and film, and the submarine ace Richard O'Kane, himself a holder of the Medal of Honor. There is a detail here that explains why his country mourned him for so long. The Japanese never reported his capture to the Red Cross. As far as any official channel back home could tell, he had simply gone into the water off Rabaul and never come out. So while he was starving on a few hundred calories a day at Ofuna, being worked and beaten, learning the small, brutal arts of staying alive in a place designed to kill you slowly, the United States was carrying him on its books as dead and preparing to hang his medal on a memory. He spent something like 20 months inside that silence, 20 months in which no letter reached his family, no name appeared on a prisoner list, no proof existed that Gregory Boyington was anything but a casualty of the 3rd of January. I want you to feel the length of that. Nearly 2 years, buried alive in the records of his own country, while the legend of the dead ace grew larger and larger back home without him. I'm going to give you the ugly part too, because the whole point of this channel is that we do not do hagiography. According to accounts relayed by the historian Daniel Ford, at least one fellow prisoner privately felt that Boyington got along too well with his captors, that he traded on his charm, that working in the camp kitchen he actually put on weight while other men wasted to skeletons around him. Ford's own comment on this is worth repeating, that there was no shame in surviving by any means a starving prisoner could find. I think that is the right way to hold it. A man in a Japanese prison camp who found a way to live through it does not owe us an apology for living. But I also will not sand it off to make him nobler than he was, because the sanding off is exactly what this story has suffered from for 80 years. He survived. He survived by being cunning and charming and adaptable, the same traits that made him a problem in garrison. And here in the camps, those traits kept him alive. There is something almost unbearable about that. For 20 months, his country carried him as dead. His family grieved. His medal was filed away as a posthumous honor. And then Japan surrendered, and the prison camps were opened. And on the 29th of August, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, American forces reached Omori. A photograph from those days shows a bedsheet stretched across a barracks roof with words painted on it for the airplanes overhead to read, telling the world that Pappy Boyington was there and alive. He had lost something like 80 pounds, and a nation that had spent nearly 2 years mourning a dead hero suddenly had a living one back on its hands, which turned out to be a far more complicated thing to manage. The country did not know what to do with him, but it very much wanted him. His story had been kept alive at home while he was gone, told on the radio and in the papers, the dashing ace lost at the peak of his record, and now here he was, gaunt and blinking in the light, a resurrection the public could hardly believe. There were parades. There were Bond appearances. There was the whole apparatus of American hero making cranked up to full power around a man who had spent the last 20 months being starved by his captors and who had no idea how to stand in a spotlight sober. The machine that had built the legend of the dead ace now had the living one to feed on, and it fed. They brought him home to a hero's reception. He had been promoted to lieutenant colonel while he was in captivity. In early October of 1945, the commandant of the Marine Corps pinned the Navy Cross on him for that last fight over Rabaul. And on the 5th of October, 1945, at the White House, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around the neck of the living, breathing Gregory Boyington, the award that had been written for a dead man, now hung on the man himself. The citation credited him with 26 aircraft destroyed and praised his heroic leadership of the Black Sheep and that audacious challenge over Kahili. It is a stirring document. It is also, on the number, almost certainly wrong, and by now you know exactly why. So let us finally settle the number, as honestly as it can be settled, because you have been patient and you have earned the accounting. The legend says 28. That figure is 22, credited with the Black Sheep, plus 6, claimed with the Flying Tigers, and it is the number the Marine Corps carried and the number the whole country learned. The Medal of Honor citation says 26, which historians including Gamble treat as a slight error baked into the paperwork, and which conveniently happens to be the exact record Boyington was chasing. The American Fighter Aces Association accredits him with 24, which is his 22 solid Black Sheep victories, plus only the 2 Flying Tigers kills that Frank Olenek could actually confirm. And Bruce Gamble, after the most thorough investigation anyone has ever done, concluded that the true figure is most likely around 25, and that Boyington claimed and was credited with 28. Daniel Ford summarized Gamble's finding in almost exactly those words. So here is what I will tell you with confidence, and it is a range, not a single false number, because a single number here is a lie, no matter which one you pick. Gregory Boyington's firmly documented total is roughly 22 confirmed with Marine Fighting Squadron 214 and 2 confirmed with the Flying Tigers, for a solid 2 dozen. The popular 28 rests on inflated Flying Tigers credits and 2 unwitnessed kills on his final flight that he signed for himself after the war. The most careful modern historian puts the real figure near 25. Whichever you take, he was among the very top Marine aces of the entire war, a genuinely great combat pilot. And whichever you take, the famous number is bigger than the truth, and at least some of that inflation came from his own hand. Both of those things are true. Holding both of them at once is the price of telling this story honestly. I will go a step further and give you my own view, since that is what this channel is for. I do not think the inflation makes him a fraud. I think it makes him human in a particularly American way. He came up broke and disrespected, in a corps that wanted rid of him. He learned that the scoreboard was the only thing that bought him respect, and he played the scoreboard the way a desperate man plays the only game that will have him. The tragedy is not that he padded a number. The tragedy is that the padded number was never necessary. 2 dozen kills, a squadron built and led to a fearsome record, a Kahili challenge that belongs in any honest history of air fighting, 20 months in a prison camp survived by sheer animal will. That was already one of the great combat records of the war. He did not need to gild it, but no one had ever taught him that he was enough, so he gilded it, and I find that sadder than any lie. What came after the war was the long, hard second act that the medal ceremony did not prepare anyone for. The living hero had no idea how to be a hero. The drinking that the Corps had tried to discipline out of him in the 1930s came roaring back with nothing to hold it in check. His marriages failed, one after another. He drifted through jobs. The man who had been magnificent for 84 days over the Solomons spent decades afterward fighting a war against himself that had no medals in it and no witnesses. He went on television game shows, A Curiosity, the famous dead man who had come back. He tried the airplane business and other business, and none of it held. For a while, it looked as though the war had been the only thing that ever fit him, and that everything after it was going to be a long, slow crash with the throttle stuck open. In 1958, he published a memoir, Ba Ba Black Sheep, and it became a bestseller. And it is where a great deal of the legend you may have arrived with actually comes from. It is a wonderful read, and it is a deeply unreliable one. Daniel Ford's judgment on it is that it is entertaining, but should be taken with a grain of salt, and I would put it more bluntly. It is the story Boyington needed to tell about himself to live with himself, and it centers him and shrinks everyone around him. The last line of the book is the man in full. "Just name a hero," he wrote, "and I will prove he is a bum." That is not the sentence of a confident legend. That is the sentence of a man who never once believed he deserved the parade. Then, in the middle of the 1970s, came the television show, and it did to the whole squadron what the press had done to the name back in 1943, only bigger. It painted the Black Sheep as a gang of misfits and screwballs led by a lovable drunk, and it was a hit, and it buried the real men under the cartoon so completely that we are still digging them out. The real veterans were furious. Frank Walton, the intelligence officer who had loved those men, wrote publicly to correct the record and then wrote his whole book to do it. Boyington himself, who worked on the show as an advisor and needed the money, admitted to his old comrades that the producers had no interest in accuracy, and he called the thing, in one honest moment, full of inaccuracies and Hollywood hokum. And I want to point something out about the airplanes, for this audience especially. The Corsairs in that show were painted a plain dark blue with almost no proper markings, partly so that a mere handful of airplanes could be filmed over and over to look like a whole squadron. If you grew up on that show believing you were seeing the real Solomon's Air War, you were seeing a soundstage with the serial numbers filed off, in every sense. He found some peace at the end, later than most men do. In the middle of the 1970s, he married a woman named Josephine, and with her finally, he got sober and stayed sober after a lifetime of failing to. He made his way back to his old squadron mates, some of whom had every reason to resent him and made their peace anyway, And he went to the air shows and the reunions and signed the prints and was, by many accounts, gentler in his final years than he had ever been able to be when the war and the number and the bottle all had their hands on him. He died on the 11th of January, 1988 in California of cancer at 75 years old, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, not far from the Tomb of the Unknowns, which is a fitting place for a man whose truest self was so long hidden under a story. Years later, his hometown named its airport for him, and the university that had taught the engineer honored the Medal of Honor man, not without an argument, because he was never able to stop being an argument. That argument outlived him. When his old university moved to honor its graduates who had received the Medal of Honor, a student objected to including Boyington at all, and the debate that followed said everything about the man. Was he a hero worth a monument, or a killer and a drunk who had embarrassed everyone who ever tried to help him? The answer, of course, was that he was both, which is the answer this channel keeps arriving at about the men the institutions could never quite digest. In the end, the memorial went up, his name among the others, the difficult man honored beside the easy ones. I suspect he would have found the whole fight more honest than a clean tribute. He never trusted a clean tribute in his life, so what do we do with Pappy Boyington in the end? Here's where I have landed, and you're free to fight me about it in the comments, because I know you will. He was a great fighter pilot and a badly damaged man, and the two were never separable. The Marine Corps needed exactly the aggression, the defiance, and the hunger that made him lethal, and it spent a decade punishing him for those same qualities on the ground. And it decorated him at last, only in the one moment when it believed he could no longer cause it any embarrassment. That is the indictment, and it is real. But I promised you I would not turn this into a hit job any more than a hagiography. So here's the other half. The Corps also gave him the airplane, the squadron, the wingmen, and the war that let him become the only thing he was ever fully at peace being, which was a combat leader in the air. He was not a lone genius surrounded by fools. He was the sharpest blade in a very well-made weapon, and the weapon was the United States Marine Corps at the height of its power. The system that could not stand him was also the system that made him possible. He would have hated me for saying that. I think it is true anyway. The number on the medal is probably wrong. The show was almost entirely invented. The nickname was a press agent's idea, and his own men called him Gramps. Peel every layer of manufactured legend off Gregory Boyington, and you do not find a smaller man underneath. You find a truer one, a broke kid from Idaho who was braver in the air than almost anyone alive and never once believed on the ground that he was worth a damn, who chased a number to prove something no number could ever prove, and who survived a Japanese prison camp only to spend the rest of his life a prisoner of the story other people told about him. I think that man deserves to be seen plainly, without the shark mouth and the bar of illegitimacy and the soundstage corsairs. I think the truth honors him more than the legend ever did. That is the pattern this channel keeps finding, in the air and on the ground alike. The men who could actually do the thing were rarely the men the institution was comfortable with, and the comfort of the institution has a way of writing the history. Boyington is one more name on that list, and not the last one we will cover. If your father or your grandfather flew the Corsair in the Solomons, or turned wrenches on those big Pratt and Whitney engines on some coral strip in the Pacific, or served with Marine Fighting Squadron 214 or any of the squadrons that fought over Rabaul, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and they are getting rarer every year. Drop them in the comments. Some of you knew these men. The rest of us are lucky to hear it from you. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.